You think you're safe in your modern world, don't you? With your smartphones and your skepticism, your science and your certainty that such dark times are behind us. But let me whisper something in your ear that will make your blood run cold tonight. The witch trials of the 17th century weren't just about superstition or religious fanaticism. They were about something far more terrifying, something that lives in the darkest corners of human nature. And you, my friend, you would have been the perfect victim. Picture this. It's 1692, and you wake up in Salem, Massachusetts. The morning air tastes of fear and damp earth. You can hear the whispers through thin wooden walls, the kind of whispers that slither like serpents through a community already drunk on paranoia. Your neighbor, the one who borrowed your axe last month and never returned it, is standing in the town square, his fingers pointing directly at you. Witch, he says. That single word, spat out like poison, seals your fate faster than any judge's gavel ever could. But here's what they never taught you in school, what the sanitized history books conveniently forgot to mention. The witch trials weren't just about witches. They were about power, control, and the delicious human appetite for destroying each other. Every accusation was a loaded gun, and everyone had their finger on the trigger. The accused witch was rarely some cackling crone in a pointed hat. More often, it was the widow who owned too much land, the woman who spoke too boldly, the man who questioned the wrong authority. It was you. The machinery of accusation was so beautifully designed, so perfectly calibrated to destroy, that it would make modern dictators weep with envy. All it took was a single pointed finger, a whispered word, a moment of neighborhood spite transformed into divine justice. And once that wheel started turning, once your name was spoken in the same breath as witch, there was no stopping it. The system didn't want to stop it. It fed on the terror, grew fat on the screams, and multiplied like a cancer through communities that had forgotten how to trust each other. You see, the real horror wasn't the supernatural, it was the natural. It was how quickly your friends became your executioners, how easily your neighbors transformed into a mob, how willingly people abandoned reason for the intoxicating rush of righteous violence. The witch trials were humanity's confession, written in blood and signed with betrayal. They revealed what we're capable of when we give ourselves permission to be monsters. In Würzburg, Germany, Prince Bishop Julius Ector didn't just hunt witches. He orchestrated a symphony of terror that would make the Inquisition look like a children's game. Between 1626 and 1631, over 1,000 people were burned alive in his territories. But here's the part that will make your skin crawl. They weren't just peasants and outcasts. They were his own relatives, clergy members, children as young as 7 years old. The bishop's own nephew, canon of the cathedral, was roasted alive for the crime of existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. When power decides to eat itself, it develops quite an appetite. The interrogation techniques were works of art, if art could be defined as the systematic destruction of human dignity. The strappado, where victims were hoisted by their arms, tied behind their backs until their shoulders dislocated, was just the warm-up act. The real masterpiece was the sleep deprivation, the endless walking, the psychological torture that made people confess to crimes that existed only in the fever dreams of their tormentors. After 3 days without sleep, you'd confess to flying to the moon if it meant the pain would stop. But perhaps the most insidious aspect was the spectral evidence. The idea that a witch's spirit could leave their body and commit crimes while they slept. This meant that being asleep was no longer an alibi. Dreams became evidence. Nightmares became testimony. Your own unconscious mind was weaponized against you. If someone claimed they saw your spirit attacking them in their sleep, how could you prove it wasn't true? How do you defend against accusations of crimes you allegedly committed while unconscious? The witch hunters weren't just religious fanatics stumbling through superstition. They were entrepreneurs of terror, traveling from town to town with their portable torture chambers and their leather-bound manuals of destruction. Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum wasn't just a book, it was a blueprint for genocide, a how-to guide for transforming communities into slaughterhouses. It sold like hotcakes across Europe, second only to the Bible in popularity. Humanity had found its favorite bedtime story, and it was written in screams. The trials created their own economy of fear. Executioners, torturers, judges, and scribes all made their living from the steady stream of accused witches. The more witches they found, the more money they made. The more money they made, the more witches they found. It was a perpetual motion machine powered by human suffering, and it ran so smoothly that no one wanted to shut it down. Even the church, which should have been the voice of mercy, found itself addicted to the power that came from being the final arbiter of life and death. Women made up roughly 80% of the accused. But this wasn't just about misogyny. It was about something deeper, more primal. It was about the fear of female knowledge, female independence, female power. The wise woman who knew herbs became the poisoner. The midwife who delivered babies became the baby killer. The widow who inherited property became the demon's consort. Every aspect of female existence was reframed as evidence of supernatural evil. They turned women's bodies into crime scenes, and their knowledge into evidence of damnation. The confession was the crown jewel of the entire system. Under torture, people would confess to anything, flying through the air, attending sabbats with the devil, transforming into animals, causing crop failures with their curses. But here's the truly diabolical part. These confessions were treated as gospel truth. The more fantastical the confession, the more it proved the reality of the supernatural threat. Logic had been turned inside out, reason had been crucified, and madness had been crowned king. Children were particularly valuable in this ecosystem of terror. Their innocence made them perfect witnesses. Their malleability made them perfect accusers. In Salem, it all started with a group of girls having fits, speaking in tongues, claiming to see invisible spirits. But these weren't just random seizures. They were performances, rehearsed and refined, that brought these children more attention than they'd ever received in their short lives. They discovered that pointing fingers was the ultimate form of power, that accusations were currency, and that fear was the most valuable commodity in town. The witch trials were democracy in reverse. Instead of the majority protecting the minority, the majority devoured it. Instead of innocent until proven guilty, it was guilty until proven dead. Instead of evidence-based justice, it was justice based on the loudest scream, the most creative confession, the most dramatic accusation. They created a legal system where the only way to prove your innocence was to die maintaining it. But this story doesn't end in the 17th century. It echoes through time like a curse that refuses to be lifted. Every time a community decides that some of its members are secretly enemies, every time fear transforms neighbors into informants, every time accusation becomes more powerful than evidence, the witch trials resurrect themselves. They put on new costumes, speak new languages, but the hunger remains the same. The hunger to point fingers, to exclude, to destroy. The next time you walk through your neighborhood, look at your neighbor's windows. Imagine them watching you, whispering about you, judging your every move. Imagine waking up to find them standing outside your door, their faces twisted with righteous anger, their voices chanting accusations you never saw coming. Because that's what the witch trials were really about. They weren't about magic or the supernatural. They were about the terrifying ordinariness of evil, the banality of betrayal, the ease with which civilization can collapse into cannibalism. And you, dear viewer, you would have been there. You would have been the one pointing fingers or the one being pointed at. You would have been the accuser or the accused, the executioner or the executed. Because that's what humans do when fear becomes law and paranoia becomes policy. We eat each other. But this is only the beginning. The real horror is yet to come. Because once you understand how the accusations started, you need to know how they were investigated, how they were prosecuted, and how they were punished. You need to understand the machinery of destruction, the bureaucracy of evil, the paperwork of persecution. You need to see how civilization created a system so perfect at destroying itself that it took centuries to finally die. So they knocked on your door. That sound, that terrible wooden percussion that changed everything, still echoes through the centuries. You've heard it 1,000 times in movies, but you've never felt it in your bones, never tasted the metallic fear that floods your mouth when you realize this isn't a social call. This is the beginning of your end. The witch hunters didn't come alone. They never came alone. They brought witnesses, scribes, and muscle. They brought the weight of divine authority wrapped in human flesh. They brought chains, and they brought questions, and they brought the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing they'll leave with what they came for: your confession, your property, or your corpse. Preferably all three. Picture the scene. It's dawn, because they always came at dawn. The hour when resistance is at its weakest, when the mind is still soft from sleep, when the soul hasn't yet armored itself for the day's battles. You're pulled from your bed, dragged into the gray morning light, and forced to face a tribunal that has already decided your fate. The trial hasn't started yet, but it's already over. You just don't know it yet. The investigative process was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as legal procedure. They didn't just want to prove you were a witch. They wanted to break you so completely that you'd help them do it. The interrogation began before you even realized you were being interrogated. Every word you spoke was a potential confession, every gesture a sign of guilt, every moment of silence an admission of dark secrets. They searched your body like archaeologists excavating a crime scene. They looked for the devil's mark, that supernatural signature that supposedly proved your pact with evil. A birthmark, a scar, a mole. Any imperfection became evidence of your corruption. They stabbed these marks with pins, and if you felt no pain, it proved you were a witch. If you screamed, it proved you were trying to hide your witchcraft. Pain was guilt, and the absence of pain was guilt. They had created a system where your own flesh testified against you. The devil's mark wasn't just a physical examination. It was a violation designed to strip away your humanity. They made you stand naked before strangers, made you endure intimate searches, made you feel like an animal being inspected for slaughter, because that's exactly what you were. The dignity they stripped away wasn't just personal, it was the dignity of being human, of having rights, of existing as something more than a problem to be solved. But the real genius was in the questioning. They didn't just ask if you were a witch, they asked about your dreams, your thoughts, your private moments. They asked about your neighbors, your family, your friends. They asked about conversations you'd had years ago, about glances you'd exchanged, about moments of anger or frustration. They turned your entire life into evidence, transformed your memories into confessions, and made your relationships into proof of conspiracy. The water test was particularly elegant in its cruelty. They bound your hands and feet and threw you into a body of water. If you floated, you were a witch, because water, being pure and holy, would reject your evil presence. If you sank, you were innocent, but you'd probably drown before they could save you. Either way, the problem was solved. They had created a test where the only way to prove your innocence was to die trying. The sleep deprivation was psychological torture refined to an art form. They kept you awake for days, walking you in endless circles, prodding you when you tried to rest, forcing you to stand when exhaustion made you collapse. After 72 hours without sleep, your mind began to fracture. You started seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices that existed only in your deteriorating consciousness. And when you finally broke, when you started babbling about flying through the air or meeting the devil in the forest, they wrote it all down as testimony. The beautiful irony was that the more you maintained your innocence, the more guilty you appeared. Innocent people, they reasoned, would confess quickly to spare themselves further suffering. Only the truly evil, only those protected by Satan himself, would endure torture without breaking. Your strength became evidence of your corruption, your endurance proof of your damnation. They had created a system where virtue was transformed into guilt and suffering into confirmation of evil. The economics of witch hunting were as methodical as any modern business model. The accused had to pay for their own imprisonment, their own torture, their own execution. You funded your own destruction. If you owned property, it was seized to cover the costs of your trial. If you had livestock, they were sold to pay for your interrogation. If you had savings, they were confiscated to finance your torture. By the time they were finished with you, your family was left with nothing but the memory of watching you burn. The scribes were perhaps the most chilling participants in this theater of horrors. They sat in the corner with their quills and their parchment, carefully documenting every scream, every confession, every moment of degradation. They created an official record of your destruction, a legal document that transformed your agony into administrative procedure. Your torture became paperwork, your death became a filing requirement. The witch hunters developed their own professional vocabulary, their own technical terminology for the business of destroying lives. They had specific words for different types of torture, precise classifications for various forms of evidence, detailed taxonomies for the hierarchy of supernatural evil. They turned the systematic destruction of human beings into a science, complete with methodologies, peer review, and published best practices. The traveling inquisitors were the celebrities of this dark world. Men like Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witch-finder general of England who turned witch hunting into a lucrative career. Hopkins charged by the witch, offering bulk discounts for communities that wanted to clean house efficiently. He had business cards, references, and a professional reputation based on his ability to find supernatural evil wherever he looked. He was an entrepreneur of terror, and business was booming. The confession was the climax of this elaborate performance. Under torture, people would confess to anything, flying to sabbats, kissing the devil's posterior, transforming into animals, causing storms with their curses. But here's the truly diabolical part. These confessions were treated as factual evidence. The more fantastical the confession, the more it proved the reality of the supernatural threat. They had created a legal system where imagination was evidence and torture was testimony. Children were particularly valuable in this ecosystem of accusations. Their innocence made them perfect witnesses. Their malleability made them ideal informants. In Würzburg, children as young as 7 were tortured into confessing their participation in witchcraft. They were forced to implicate their parents, their siblings, their playmates. The witch hunters had discovered that the most effective way to destroy a community was to turn its children into weapons against their own families. The religious justification was the poisonous icing on this cake of horrors. They convinced themselves that torture was mercy, that burning people alive was salvation, that destroying communities was divine service. They wrapped their sadism in scripture, disguised their cruelty as compassion, and transformed their bloodlust into holy duty. They had created a system where the most evil acts were reframed as the most righteous service. The legal procedure was a facade, a theatrical performance designed to provide the illusion of justice while guaranteeing the predetermined outcome. The judges weren't seeking truth, they were confirming guilt. The trials weren't about evidence, they were about providing sufficient documentation to justify the execution. The entire legal system had been inverted, transformed from a mechanism for protecting the innocent into a machine for processing the guilty. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect was how normal it all became. Communities that had been terrorized by witch trials for months or years began to accept them as routine. The screaming from the interrogation chambers became background noise. The smoke from the burning pyres became part of the landscape. The absence of neighbors who had been accused became an accepted part of daily life. They had normalized horror, institutionalized terror, and bureaucratized genocide. The witch trials weren't an aberration, they were a logical conclusion. They were what happened when fear became policy, when paranoia became law, when the desire for certainty became more important than the commitment to truth. They were the inevitable result of a system that valued confession over evidence, accusation over proof, and the appearance of justice over its reality. And you, sitting in your comfortable modern world, you think this could never happen to you. You think your laws and your rights and your skepticism would protect you. But laws can be changed, rights can be suspended, and skepticism can be criminalized. The machinery of accusation doesn't need to be rebuilt. It just needs to be reactivated. The only thing standing between you and the witch trials is the collective decision to value truth over comfort, evidence over emotion, and the protection of the innocent over the satisfaction of the mob. But we're not done yet. Because once they had you, once they had broken you, once they had extracted your confession and seized your property and destroyed your reputation, they still had to decide what to do with you. And that's where the real creativity began. That's where they showed you what human beings are capable of when they give themselves permission to be monsters. The execution was never just about death. Death was easy, quick, merciful. What they wanted was theater, spectacle, a performance that would burn itself into the collective memory of everyone who witnessed it. They wanted to create a moment so terrible, so unforgettable, that it would haunt the community for generations. They wanted to transform your death into a lesson that would teach others the price of resistance. The pyre wasn't just a method of execution, it was a statement written in flesh and flame. They built it in the town square, in the marketplace, in the center of whatever space would hold the most witnesses. They wanted everyone to see, everyone to smell, everyone to remember. The wood was carefully selected, arranged with architectural precision to ensure maximum burning time. They didn't want you to die quickly. They wanted you to burn slowly, to scream loudly, to provide the fullest possible demonstration of divine justice in action. But here's what will make your blood freeze tonight. The burning wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the walk to the pyre, the parade of humiliation that preceded your death. You were dragged through the streets you had walked as a free person, past the shops where you had bought bread, past the neighbors who had once greeted you with smiles. Now they threw stones, spat curses, called you demon and devil spawn. The same voices that had once wished you good morning now screamed for your blood. The crowd was the most terrifying aspect of the entire spectacle. These weren't professional executioners or religious fanatics. They were ordinary people, transformed into a mob. They were your baker, your blacksmith, your children's playmates. They were people who had borrowed your tools, shared your meals, attended your weddings. Now they pressed forward eagerly, hungrily, desperately, hoping to get close enough to see the flames catch your hair, to hear your final screams, to witness the moment when the supernatural evil inside you was finally purged by holy fire. The psychological preparation for execution was its own form of torture. You were given time to contemplate your death, to imagine the flames, to anticipate the pain. They offered you the chance to confess one final time, to implicate more neighbors, to add more names to the growing list of suspects. Even at the moment of death, you were expected to serve their cause, to help them expand their harvest of accused witches. The clergy played their role with theatrical precision. They offered you salvation at the last moment, promising that if you confessed your sins and begged for forgiveness, God might show you mercy in the afterlife. But this wasn't about mercy, it was about performance. They needed you to validate their authority, to confirm their righteousness, to demonstrate that even in death, you acknowledged their power over your soul. The technical aspects of burning were refined through centuries of practice. They knew exactly how much wood to use, how to arrange the kindling, how to position the body for maximum visibility. They had learned that green wood burned slower, that certain arrangements created more dramatic flames, that specific positioning ensured the crowd could see everything. They had turned murder into an art form, execution into entertainment. Some communities developed their own signature variations. In Germany, they favored the slow burn, building the fire gradually around the victim's feet and working upward. In France, they preferred the quick immolation, surrounding the victim completely and lighting all sides simultaneously. In England, they sometimes granted the mercy of strangulation before burning, but only if the victim had provided particularly valuable confession. Each region had its own style, its own traditions, its own preferred methods of public murder. The economic dimension extended even to the execution itself. The victim's family was often required to pay for the wood, the rope, the labor of building the pyre. They had to fund the spectacle of their loved one's death, contribute to the cost of their own grief. If they couldn't afford the execution, the community would cover the costs and add them to the family's debt. You literally paid for your own murder, and if you couldn't pay, your descendants would inherit the bill. The timing of executions was carefully orchestrated for maximum impact. They chose market days when the most people would be present, religious holidays when the moral message would be strongest, or seasons when the agricultural work was light and people had time to attend. They turned your death into a community event, a social gathering, a shared experience that bonded the survivors in their collective righteousness. Children were encouraged to attend these spectacles. Parents brought their sons and daughters to witness the burning, to learn the consequences of evil, to understand what happened to those who strayed from the path of righteousness. They turned your death into a teaching moment, your agony into a moral lesson, your screams into a cautionary tale that would follow these children for the rest of their lives. The festival atmosphere was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the entire event. Vendors sold food and drink to the crowd. Merchants hawked souvenirs. Children played games between the executions. They had turned murder into a market day, death into a celebration, your final moments into entertainment for the masses. The community that had once welcomed you now celebrated your destruction. But the burning itself was just the beginning of your post-mortem persecution. Your ashes were scattered to prevent any possible resurrection. Your property was distributed among your accusers. Your name was struck from official records. They didn't just kill your body. They murdered your memory, erased your existence, deleted you from the community's history. You became a non-person, a cautionary tale, a whispered warning about the dangers of stepping outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Your family inherited not just your death, but your stigma. Your children were marked as the offspring of evil, your spouse as the partner of a demon, your parents as the ones who had raised a witch. The corruption was considered hereditary, the evil genetic, the taint permanent. They had created a system where your death contaminated everyone you had ever loved, where your punishment extended through generations. The psychological aftermath rippled through the community like a plague. People became hypervigilant, constantly watching their neighbors for signs of supernatural evil. They monitored their own behavior, censored their own thoughts, suppressed their own individuality out of fear that they might be next. The witch trials had created a community of informants, a society of spies, a culture of constant surveillance and mutual suspicion. The religious justification reached its peak during the execution itself. The clergy proclaimed that your death was a victory for God, that your suffering was a necessary purification, that your screams were evidence of Satan being driven from your body. They had transformed murder into ministry, execution into exorcism, genocide into divine service. They had created a theology of torture, a spirituality of suffering, a religion of revenge. The legal documentation continued even after death. Scribes recorded the time of death, the manner of dying, the final words spoken. They created official records of your destruction, legal proof that justice had been served, administrative confirmation that the supernatural threat had been eliminated. Your death became paperwork. Your murder became a filing requirement. Your final moments became a bureaucratic record. The disposal of your remains was handled with clinical efficiency. The ashes were collected, examined for any remaining traces of evil, then scattered in running water or buried in unconsecrated ground. They wanted to ensure that no part of you remained, that no relic could be recovered, that no shrine could be built to your memory. They had killed you so thoroughly that they tried to kill your death itself. The community moved on with disturbing ease. The market resumed the next day. The shops reopened. The children went back to their games. The space where you had died was cleaned. The ashes were swept away. The scorch marks were scrubbed from the stones. Within days, it was as if you had never existed, as if your death had never happened, as if the entire spectacle had been nothing more than a collective nightmare. But the memory persisted in the survivors. The smell of burning flesh lingered in their nostrils. The sound of your screams echoed in their ears. The image of your final moments haunted their dreams. They had witnessed something that fundamentally changed them, something that revealed the terrible capacity for evil that lurked within their own community. They had seen what human beings were capable of when they gave themselves permission to be monsters. The witch trials had created a new form of social control, a system of governance based on fear rather than law, on accusation rather than evidence, on the terror of being next rather than the security of being protected. They had transformed communities into concentration camps, neighbors into executioners, and justice into a weapon of mass destruction. And you, comfortable in your modern world, you think this could never happen again. You think your technology and your education and your sophisticated understanding of human psychology would protect you from such barbarism. But the witch trials weren't about ignorance. They were about human nature. They weren't about superstition. They were about power. They weren't about the past. They were about the eternal capacity for evil that lives in every human heart. The next time you attend a public event, look around at the crowd. Notice how quickly excitement can turn to anger, how easily enthusiasm can become rage, how readily people will follow leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. Notice how the same voices that cheer for justice can scream for blood, how the same hands that applaud heroism can throw stones at victims, how the same hearts that beat with compassion can pump with the rhythm of revenge. Because that's what the witch trials were really about. They weren't historical curiosities or medieval aberrations. They were demonstrations of what happens when communities decide that some of their members are expendable, when fear becomes more powerful than law, when the desire for certainty becomes more important than the commitment to truth. They were previews of every genocide, every pogrom, every massacre that would follow in the centuries to come. The survivors were the walking wounded of a war that had no battlefields, only burning pyres and broken families. They were the ones who had escaped the flames, but could never escape the smoke. The ones who had avoided the accusations, but could never avoid the memories. They were the living proof that sometimes death is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Sometimes watching death, participating in death, surviving death is infinitely worse. Picture Margaret Jacobs, a 20-year-old woman in Salem who was forced to watch her grandfather hanged as a witch. She had given testimony against him under torture, had been coerced into implicating the man who had raised her, had been transformed into the weapon that destroyed her own family. She survived the trials, but she never survived the guilt. She spent the rest of her life writing letters of apology, begging forgiveness from the families she had helped destroy, trying to repair a world that her forced testimony had helped shatter. The children were perhaps the most tragic survivors. They had been used as informants, witnesses, and weapons in a war they couldn't understand. 10-year-old girls had been coached to identify witches, to describe sabbats they had never attended, to testify about supernatural events they had never witnessed. They had been turned into little engines of destruction, their innocence weaponized, their youth corrupted by the adults who should have protected them. The psychological trauma manifested in ways that wouldn't be understood for centuries. The survivors developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, but in the 17th century it was just called madness. They couldn't sleep without seeing the faces of the accused, couldn't eat without tasting the smoke from the pyres, couldn't walk through their towns without remembering the screams. They had witnessed something that fundamentally broke their understanding of human nature, something that revealed the monster lurking beneath the surface of civilization. The economic devastation was equally profound. Entire families had been wiped out, their properties confiscated, their businesses destroyed. The survivors inherited not just grief, but debt, not just trauma, but poverty. The witch trials had created a new class of victim, the collateral damage of supernatural justice, the innocent casualties of holy war. They were the ones who had to rebuild their lives in the ruins of their communities. The religious crisis was perhaps the most insidious consequence. The survivors had been taught that the witch trials were God's work, that the executions were divine justice, that the suffering was holy purification. But many had witnessed the execution of people they knew to be innocent, had seen the torture of neighbors they knew to be good, had watched their communities destroy themselves in the name of righteousness. They were left with a choice between admitting that their religion was a lie or accepting that their God was a monster. The social fabric had been torn beyond repair. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored. Neighbors who had accused neighbors could never again look each other in the eye. Friends who had testified against friends could never again share a meal in peace. The witch trials had created a community of strangers, a society of suspects, a culture where everyone was both potential victim and potential executioner. The silence was deafening. In the aftermath of the trials, communities developed a collective amnesia about what had happened. They didn't want to remember, didn't want to discuss, didn't want to acknowledge the horror they had participated in. The witch trials became the town's dirty secret, the collective shame that everyone knew but nobody mentioned. They had created a conspiracy of silence that would last for generations. The legal system struggled to cope with the aftermath. How do you compensate someone for torture? How do you restore a reputation destroyed by false accusations? How do you rebuild a legal system that had been corrupted by fear and prejudice? Some communities attempted restitution, paying small sums to the families of the executed, but money couldn't bring back the dead or heal the trauma of the living. The witch hunters themselves faced their own reckoning. Some, like Samuel Parris, the minister who had helped ignite the Salem trials, were driven from their communities in disgrace. Others, like Matthew Hopkins, simply disappeared, vanishing into the countryside to avoid the growing backlash against their work. A few, like Cotton Mather, doubled down on their beliefs, insisting that the trials had been necessary, that the executions had been justified, that the only mistake had been stopping too soon. The medical community began to develop new explanations for the symptoms that had been attributed to witchcraft. Physicians started to recognize that the fits and seizures that had been blamed on supernatural possession might have natural causes. The hallucinations that had been treated as evidence of demonic influence might be symptoms of mental illness. The physical ailments that had been blamed on curses might be the result of disease or poisoning. The intellectual backlash was slow but inevitable. Scholars began to question the evidence that had been used to convict witches, to challenge the legal procedures that had been employed, to doubt the theological justifications that had been offered. Books were written criticizing the trials. Pamphlets were published exposing the flaws in the system. Essays were distributed questioning the entire enterprise. The witch trials had created their own opposition, their own skeptics, their own intellectual enemies. The generational trauma was perhaps the most lasting consequence. The children who had witnessed the trials grew up to become adults who couldn't trust authority, couldn't believe in justice, couldn't have faith in their communities. They raised children who inherited their fear, their suspicion, their deep-seated understanding that civilization was just a thin veneer over barbarism. The witch trials had created a genetic legacy of trauma that would be passed down through families for generations. The geographic spread of the trauma was equally profound. Communities that had experienced witch trials became cautionary tales for other towns, warnings about what could happen when fear overwhelmed reason. The reputation of entire regions was stained by the blood of the accused, the memory of entire provinces haunted by the screams of the innocent. The witch trials had created a geography of shame, a map of human cruelty that would never be erased. The political consequences were far-reaching. The witch trials had demonstrated the danger of combining religious authority with civil power, of allowing fear to override legal procedure, of permitting accusation to become evidence. They had shown what happened when communities gave up their commitment to individual rights in exchange for the promise of collective security. The witch trials had become a case study in the fragility of democracy, the vulnerability of justice, the ease with which freedom could be transformed into tyranny. The literary response was immediate and lasting. Writers began to use the witch trials as metaphors for other forms of persecution, as symbols of the dangers of mass hysteria, as warnings about the capacity for evil that lurked within every human heart. The witch trials had entered the cultural consciousness as a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for self-destruction. The international implications were profound. The witch trials had spread across Europe like a plague, moving from country to country, adapting to local customs and beliefs, but maintaining their essential character. They had demonstrated that the capacity for evil was universal, that the susceptibility to mass hysteria was global, that the human tendency toward persecution was a species-wide trait. The scientific revolution was partly a response to the witch trials. The emphasis on empirical evidence, on reproducible experiments, on logical reasoning, was a direct reaction to the irrationality and superstition that had fueled the persecutions. The witch trials had helped create their own antidote, their own intellectual opposition, their own rational response. The legal reforms that followed were comprehensive but incomplete. New procedures were established to prevent false accusations, new standards were created for evidence, new protections were instituted for the accused. But the fundamental problem remained: the human capacity for evil, the tendency toward persecution, the willingness to sacrifice individuals for the supposed good of the community. The religious reformation was equally complex. Some denominations abandoned the belief in witchcraft entirely, while others simply modified their approach to supernatural evil. The witch trials had forced Christianity to confront its own capacity for cruelty, its own tendency toward persecution, its own willingness to use violence in the name of righteousness. The psychological understanding that emerged from the trials was revolutionary. For the first time, communities began to recognize that mass hysteria was a real phenomenon, that group psychology could override individual reason, that fear could be contagious and destructive. The witch trials had inadvertently created the foundation for modern psychology, the beginning of our understanding of crowd behavior and social contagion. The cultural legacy is with us still. Every time a community turns against its own members, every time fear overrides reason, every time accusation becomes more powerful than evidence, the witch trials are reborn. They put on new costumes, speak new languages, use new technologies, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same: the human capacity for evil, the tendency toward persecution, the willingness to destroy others in the name of righteousness. The survivors of the witch trials didn't just live with trauma, they lived with knowledge. They knew what human beings were capable of when they gave themselves permission to be monsters. They knew how quickly civilization could collapse into barbarism, how easily communities could transform into killing machines, how readily ordinary people could become executioners, and that knowledge, that terrible understanding of human nature, was their real inheritance. It was the burden they carried, the secret they kept, the warning they tried to pass down to future generations. They had seen behind the mask of civilization, had witnessed the monster that lurked beneath the surface of society, had experienced the ease with which good people could become evil people, but their warning was ignored, their knowledge was forgotten, their testimony was dismissed as the ravings of traumatized minds, and so the witch trials continued, in new forms, in new places, with new victims and new executioners. Because the fundamental problem wasn't witchcraft or superstition or religious fanaticism, the fundamental problem was human nature itself, the capacity for evil that lives in every human heart, the willingness to destroy others that emerges whenever fear overwhelms reason. The survivors died knowing that it would happen again, that the witch trials were not an aberration, but a preview, not a historical curiosity, but a recurring nightmare. They died knowing that the monsters they had seen were not supernatural entities, but human beings, not demons from hell, but neighbors from next door, not evil incarnate, but ordinary people who had been given permission to be cruel. And they were right, because the witch trials never really ended. They just changed costumes, learned new languages, and found new victims. The machinery of accusation, the psychology of persecution, the politics of fear, they're all still with us, waiting for the next crisis, the next opportunity, the next moment when communities decide that some of their members are expendable. The next time you see a crowd gathering, the next time you hear accusations flying, the next time you witness the transformation of neighbors into enemies, remember the survivors of the witch trials. Remember what they saw, what they knew, what they tried to warn us about. Remember that the capacity for evil is not historical or geographical or cultural. It's human. It's universal. It's eternal. The witch trials didn't end because people suddenly became rational. They didn't stop because communities grew enlightened or because justice finally prevailed. They ended because they had consumed everything in their path, because they had run out of victims, because they had devoured the very communities that had created them. The witch trials ended the way all cancers end. Either they kill the host, or the host finds a way to kill them. By the 1690s, the machinery of accusation had become so efficient, so indiscriminate, so hungry for victims, that it had begun to consume itself. The accusations were flying so fast that no one was safe. The confessions were so elaborate that they had become obviously fictional. The executions were so numerous that even the bloodthirsty crowds were growing weary of the spectacle. The witch trials had become a monster that had grown too large for its own ecosystem. The turning point came when the wrong people started getting accused. As long as the victims were outsiders, misfits, the poor, and the powerless, the communities could maintain their enthusiasm for supernatural justice. But when the accusations began to target the wealthy, the connected, the respected members of society, suddenly the entire enterprise began to look suspicious. When the minister's wife was accused, when the judge's daughter was implicated, when the merchants and landowners found themselves facing the same charges as the beggars and outcasts, the witch trials had finally overreached. The case of Rebecca Nurse in Salem was the beginning of the end. She was a 71-year-old woman respected in the community, known for her piety and charity. When she was accused of witchcraft, something fundamental shifted in the collective consciousness. People who had cheered for the execution of social outcasts suddenly found themselves questioning the entire system. If Rebecca Nurse could be a witch, then anyone could be a witch. And if anyone could be a witch, then maybe no one was a witch. The economic reality was equally devastating. The witch trials had become so expensive that they were bankrupting the communities that hosted them. The cost of trials, imprisonments, executions, and confiscations was enormous. The loss of productive members of society was equally costly. When you're burning your farmers, your craftsmen, your merchants, and your skilled laborers, you're not just committing murder, you're committing economic suicide. The legal system began to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. Judges who had enthusiastically condemned hundreds of witches suddenly found themselves questioning the evidence, the procedures, the entire foundation of supernatural justice. The spectral evidence that had been the cornerstone of witch trials was finally recognized as legally worthless. Dreams and visions and invisible spirits couldn't be cross-examined, couldn't be verified, couldn't be used as evidence in any rational legal system. The religious authorities who had championed the witch trials began to distance themselves from the carnage. Some claimed they had been misled by false evidence. Others insisted they had been following the best theological guidance available. Still others simply denied their involvement entirely. The very institutions that had provided the moral justification for the trials were now desperately trying to escape responsibility for their consequences. The intellectual backlash was swift and merciless. Scholars who had once written treatises supporting the reality of witchcraft now published essays questioning the entire enterprise. The same theological authorities who had endorsed the Malleus Maleficarum now condemned it as a work of dangerous superstition. The academic community that had provided the intellectual framework for the trials was now systematically dismantling that framework. The international dimension was equally important. As news of the witch trials spread across Europe, communities that had not yet experienced the phenomenon began to take precautions. They established legal safeguards, created procedural protections, and developed skeptical attitudes toward accusations of witchcraft. The witch trials had become their own warning system, their own cautionary tale, their own prevention program. The emergence of natural philosophy, what we now call science, provided an alternative explanation for the phenomena that had been attributed to witchcraft. Physicians began to recognize that the fits and seizures that had been blamed on supernatural possession might have medical causes. Botanists began to understand that the hallucinations that had been attributed to demonic influence might be the result of ergot poisoning or other natural. The scientific revolution was partly a response to the witch trials, an attempt to provide rational explanations for irrational events. The printing press played a crucial role in ending the witch trial. As literacy spread and books became more common, people had access to alternative viewpoints, competing theories, and critical analyses of the witch-hunting phenomenon. The same technology that had spread the Malleus Maleficarum across Europe now spread critiques of that work, exposing its flaws and questioning its conclusions. The political climate was changing as well. The wars of religion that had ravaged Europe for centuries were finally winding down, and with them, the religious fanaticism that had fueled the witch trials. The emergence of more secular forms of government, the separation of church and state, and the development of individual rights all worked against the continuation of supernatural justice. The generational change was perhaps the most important factor. The children who had grown up during the witch trials were now adults. They remembered not just the terror, but the trauma. They had seen their communities destroy themselves, had witnessed the murder of innocent people, had experienced the collapse of social trust. They were determined not to repeat the mistakes of their parents, not to allow fear to override reason, not to permit accusation to become evidence. The witch trials had created their own opposition, their own skeptics, their own intellectual enemies. Every execution had created families of survivors who knew the truth. Every trial had created witnesses who remembered the innocence of the accused. Every community that had experienced the witch trials had created a group of people who were determined never to let it happen again. The decline was gradual but inexorable. Fewer accusations were made, fewer confessions were accepted, fewer executions were carried out. The machinery of supernatural justice was slowly grinding to a halt, not because it had been defeated, but because it had exhausted itself. The witch trials were dying of their own success, collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. The last witch trial in Salem was in 1693, but the phenomenon lingered in other parts of Europe for decades. The last execution for witchcraft in England was in 1684, in Scotland in 1727, in France in 1745, in Germany in 1775. The witch trials didn't end all at once. They faded away like a disease that had finally run its course, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a legacy of trauma that would last for centuries. The official apologies came decades later. In 1711, the Massachusetts General Court reversed the convictions of most of the Salem victims and provided financial compensation to their families. In 1736, the British Parliament repealed the Witchcraft Act, effectively ending the legal basis for witch trials in the English-speaking world. Other European countries followed suit, gradually dismantling the legal frameworks that had made the witch trials possible. But the apologies were hollow, the compensation was inadequate, and the legal reforms were too late for the thousands who had already died. The witch trials had ended not because justice had prevailed, but because the system had finally consumed itself. The monster had grown too large for its cage. The cancer had metastasized beyond control. The fire had burned through all available fuel. The historical revisionism began almost immediately. Communities that had enthusiastically participated in witch trials now claimed they had been deceived, misled, or coerced. The judges who had condemned hundreds of witches now insisted they had been following the best legal guidance available. The ministers who had preached the reality of supernatural evil now claimed they had been protecting their communities from a genuine threat. The collective amnesia was profound and deliberate. Towns that had been sites of mass murder now avoided mentioning their dark history. Families that had been involved in accusations now changed their names and moved away. The witch trials became the shameful secret that everyone knew but nobody discussed. The collective trauma that was buried but never forgotten. The lessons were learned but not internalized. The legal reforms prevented future witch trials, but they didn't prevent future witch hunts. The intellectual advances discredited supernatural explanations, but they didn't eliminate the human capacity for persecution. The social changes reduced the power of religious authorities, but they didn't eliminate the tendency toward mass hysteria. The witch trials had ended, but the underlying psychology remained. The willingness to believe accusations without evidence, the tendency to turn neighbors into enemies, the capacity for ordinary people to become executioners, these traits hadn't disappeared. They had simply gone underground, waiting for the next crisis, the next opportunity, the next moment when fear would overwhelm reason. The modern world likes to think it has moved beyond such primitive barbarism, that education and technology and human rights have made witch trials impossible. But the witch trials weren't about primitive barbarism. They were about human nature. They weren't about ignorance and superstition. They were about power and control. They weren't about the past. They were about the eternal human capacity for evil. The witch trials ended, but they didn't die. They transformed, adapted, evolved. They learned new languages, adopted new technologies, found new victims. The accusations of supernatural evil became accusations of political subversion, of social deviance, of cultural betrayal. The pyres became gas chambers. The drowning tests became show trials. The confessions became public humiliations. Every genocide, every pogrom, every mass persecution that has followed the witch trials has used the same basic formula. Identify a group of people as a threat to the community, create a system of accusation and punishment, convince the majority that the minority is dangerous, and then systematically destroy the designated victims. The witch trials were the prototype, the original template, the first draft of every atrocity that would follow. The survivors of the witch trials died knowing that their nightmare would return, that the monster they had witnessed was not dead but dormant, that the capacity for evil they had seen was not historical but eternal. They died knowing that the witch trials were not an aberration but a preview, not a medieval curiosity, but a recurring nightmare that would haunt humanity for as long as humans existed. And they were right, because the witch trials never really ended. They just changed costumes, learned new scripts, and found new stages. The actors are different, the props have been updated, the dialogue has been modernized, but the play remains the same. It's the story of how communities destroy themselves, how fear overwhelms reason, how ordinary people become monsters when they give themselves permission to be cruel. The witch trials are not history, they are prophecy. They are not a memory of what happened. They are a warning of what will happen. They are not a relic of the past. They are a preview of the future. And the future, my friend, is always just one accusation away. So here we are, at the end of this journey through humanity's darkest chapter. You've walked through the accusations, witnessed the trials, felt the heat of the flames, and seen the aftermath. You've experienced the complete machinery of human destruction, the perfect system for turning neighbors into executioners and communities into slaughterhouses. But if you think this story ends in the 17th century, if you believe this nightmare is safely buried in the past, then you've learned nothing at all. The witch trials didn't end because humanity suddenly became enlightened. They didn't stop because people grew wise or compassionate or rational. They ended because they had fulfilled their purpose, because they had taught us something fundamental about ourselves, something we desperately didn't want to learn. They ended because they had revealed the monster that lives in every human heart, the capacity for evil that hibernates in every community, the willingness to destroy that sleeps in every civilization. Look around you right now. Look at your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends. Look at the people you pass on the street, the faces you see in the grocery store, the voices you hear on the news. These are the same people who would have lit your pyre, who would have cheered your execution, who would have celebrated your death, not because they were evil, but because they were human, not because they were monsters, but because they were ordinary. The witch trials taught us that the line between civilization and barbarism is not a wall, but a thread, not a fortress, but a whisper. It taught us that the difference between a neighbor and an executioner is not character, but circumstance, not morality, but opportunity. It taught us that the transformation from citizen to killer requires nothing more than permission, justification, and the intoxicating promise that this time, the violence is righteous. Every morning when you wake up, you make a choice. You choose to live in a world where accusations require evidence, where guilt must be proven, where the innocent are protected from the mob. But that choice is not guaranteed, not permanent, not secure. It's a daily decision that can be revoked, overturned, abandoned the moment your community decides that security is more important than justice, that certainty is more valuable than truth. The witch trials created a template, a blueprint, a user's manual for systematic persecution. They showed us exactly how to transform a community into a killing machine, how to turn citizens into informants, how to make ordinary people complicit in extraordinary evil. And that template has been used again and again, refined and perfected, adapted to new times and new victims, but never fundamentally changed. The Salem witch trials became the Moscow show trials. The Spanish Inquisition became the Cultural Revolution. The witch-finders became the secret police. The spectral evidence became the forced confessions. The burning pyres became the gas chambers. The accusation of supernatural evil became the accusation of political subversion, of racial impurity, of cultural betrayal. The names changed, the costumes were updated, the technology was modernized, but the fundamental dynamic remained identical. You think your laws protect you, your rights shield you, your democracy guards you. But laws can be changed overnight, rights can be suspended by emergency decree, and democracy can be voted out of existence. The witch trials happened in communities that had laws, that valued justice, that considered themselves civilized. They happened because people chose to abandon their principles when those principles became inconvenient, when fear became more comfortable than freedom. The digital age has made the witch trials more possible, not less. Social media has created the perfect platform for accusations to spread faster than wildfire, for mob justice to organize in real time, for reputations to be destroyed with a single tweet. The anonymous nature of online discourse has removed the human element that once made communities hesitant to destroy their own members. Now you can participate in someone's destruction without ever looking them in the eye, without ever seeing their pain, without ever witnessing the human cost of your righteous anger. The cancel culture phenomenon is just the latest incarnation of the witch trials. The same dynamic, the same psychology, the same machinery of destruction. Someone is accused of violating the community's moral standards. The accusation spreads through social networks. A mob forms to demand justice, and the accused is systematically destroyed. Their career ended, their reputation ruined, their life shattered. The only difference is that instead of burning the body, we burn the soul. Instead of destroying the person, we destroy the persona. Instead of killing the witch, we kill the identity. The rehabilitation is impossible, the forgiveness is non-existent, the redemption is forbidden. Once accused, always guilty. Once targeted, always marked. Once destroyed, always destroyed. The witch trials taught us that there are some sins for which there is no forgiveness, some crimes for which there is no statute of limitations, some accusations for which there is no defense. But the most terrifying aspect of the modern witch trials is how normal they've become, how acceptable they seem, how righteously they're justified. We've convinced ourselves that this time it's different, that this time the accusations are true, that this time the destruction is deserved. We've told ourselves that we're fighting for justice, protecting the innocent, making the world a better place. We've created the same moral framework that justified the original witch trials, the same psychological mechanisms that made ordinary people into executioners. The witch trials never ended because the human nature that created them never changed. The capacity for evil that fueled them never disappeared. The willingness to destroy that drove them never diminished. They just learned to hide better, to disguise themselves more effectively, to justify themselves more persuasively. Every time you share an accusation without verifying it, every time you join a mob without questioning its motives, every time you participate in someone's destruction without examining the evidence, you become a witch hunter. Every time you choose the comfort of conformity over the difficulty of dissent, every time you pick safety over justice, every time you select the tribe over the truth, you become complicit in the eternal return of the witch trials. The survivors of the original witch trials died knowing that their nightmare would return, that the monster they had witnessed was immortal, that the capacity for evil they had seen was eternal. They died knowing that the witch trials were not a historical aberration, but a recurring nightmare, not a medieval curiosity, but a modern prophecy, not a relic of the past, but a preview of the future. And they were right. Because the witch trials are happening right now, in your community, in your workplace, in your social media feeds. They're happening every time someone is accused without evidence, condemned without trial, destroyed without mercy. They're happening every time a community decides that some of its members are expendable, that some accusations are too important to verify, that some justice is too urgent to delay. The witch trials taught us that the most dangerous words in any language are not curses or threats or declarations of war. They are the words that make destruction seem righteous, that make cruelty seem compassionate, that make evil seem good. They are the words that transform ordinary people into monsters, that turn neighbors into executioners, that make communities complicit in their own destruction. Those words are, this time it's different. This time it's justified. This time it's necessary. This time it's right. But it's never different. It's never justified. It's never necessary. It's never right. It's always the same human capacity for evil dressed up in new clothes, the same willingness to destroy disguised as moral duty, the same witch trials wearing a different mask. The witch trials are not history. They are prophecy. They are not a memory of what was. They are a warning of what will be. They are not a relic of the past. They are a preview of the future. And the future, my friend, is always just one accusation away. The next time you see a crowd gathering around a victim, the next time you hear the familiar chant of righteous anger, the next time you witness the transformation of a person into a problem to be solved, remember the witch trials. Remember what they were really about. Remember what they taught us. Remember what they revealed. Remember that the capacity for evil is not historical. It's human. It's not geographical. It's universal. It's not cultural. It's eternal. Remember that the monster is not some external threat, some foreign enemy, some supernatural entity. The monster is us. The monster is the human capacity for evil that lives in every heart, sleeps in every community, and waits in every civilization for the moment when fear overwhelms reason, when accusation becomes evidence, when the mob becomes the law. Remember that the witch trials never ended. They just changed costumes, learned new languages, and found new victims. The pyres became gas chambers, became cancel culture, became whatever comes next. The accusation of supernatural evil became political subversion, became social deviance, became cultural betrayal, became whatever accusation serves the needs of the moment. Remember that you are not immune. You are not special. You are not protected. You are human, and that means you are both capable of being a victim and capable of being a perpetrator. You are both vulnerable to the witch trials and complicit in their continuation. Remember that the witch trials will return. They will come to your community, your workplace, your social circle. They will come with new names, new justifications, new technologies, but the same fundamental dynamic. They will come because they are part of human nature, because they serve human needs, because they fulfill human desires. Remember that when they come, you will have a choice. You can be the accuser or the accused, the executioner or the executed, the mob or the victim. You can participate in the destruction or resist it, enable it or oppose it, perpetuate it or end it. Remember that your choice will define not just your own soul, but the soul of your community, not just your own legacy, but the legacy of your civilization, not just your own fate, but the fate of everyone who comes after you. Remember that the witch trials are not about witches. They never were. They are about us. They are about the human capacity for evil, the willingness to destroy, the ability to transform neighbors into enemies and communities into killing machine. Remember that the witch trials are not a story with an ending. They are a story that never ends, a nightmare that never stops, a warning that is never heeded. Remember that the witch trials are not history. They are prophecy, and the prophecy is always fulfilled. The witch trials are coming. They are always coming. They never stopped coming. And when they arrive at your door, when they point their finger at your neighbor, when they light their fires in your town square, you will remember this moment. You will remember this warning. You will remember that you knew, that you were told, that you were given the chance to choose differently. But you will choose the same way humans always choose. You will choose fear over courage, conformity over dissent, the mob over the individual, the witch trials over justice. Because that's what humans do. That's what we've always done. That's what we'll always do. The witch trials are not a historical curiosity. They are a human inevitability. They are not a relic of the past. They are a guarantee of the future. They are not a cautionary tale. They are a promise, and the promise is always kept. Welcome to the witch trials. You've been here all along. You just didn't know it yet, but now you do. Now you know. And knowing changes nothing, because the witch trials are not about knowledge. They're about nature, human nature, and human nature never changes. The witch trials are eternal, and so are we.